Willow Lane had always been known as the peaceful side of town, a place where families thrived, where children played in the streets, and where everyone knew everyone. But there was one house on the far edge of the lane, nestled behind tall, gnarled trees, that no one talked about. The neighbors said it was cursed, that anyone who dared live there would be driven mad. For years, it remained empty, until one unsuspecting family, the Anders, moved in, hoping to make a fresh start. They had no idea of the horrors waiting within its walls. The Anders family, Emma, her husband, Daniel, and their 2 children, Max and Lily, had always dreamed of a life in the country. City life had taken a toll, and Willow Lane seemed like the perfect escape. Emma fell in love with the old house the moment she saw it, charmed by its Victorian architecture and large, secluded yard. She couldn't understand why it had been on the market for so long, or why the agent seemed eager to finalize the sale as quickly as possible. They moved in on a warm spring morning, laughing, unpacking, dreaming of the life they would build together. But within days, they'd discover that something sinister lingered, watching from the shadows. At first, it was the little things, odd enough to be noticed, but not alarming. Emma would catch a cold draft in the hallway, even though the windows were closed. The mirrors seemed to fog up, displaying strange handprints, and at night, they would hear faint creaks, as if someone was walking slowly through the house. But the real trouble began when Max, their youngest, started talking about a woman he called the Lady in White. Max was only 5, full of imagination, so Emma dismissed it as harmless. But as the nights passed, Max's stories grew more specific. "She stands by the window, Mommy," he'd say, his eyes wide and unblinking. "She's watching us." Emma tried to ignore it, tried to laugh it off, but her nerves were beginning to fray. It wasn't long before she started seeing things herself. Late one night, while lying in bed, she heard a faint whisper right next to her ear, a low, mournful voice murmuring her name. She sat up, her heart racing, but the room was empty. Daniel brushed it off as a bad dream, but Emma knew what she'd heard. She began to notice shadows where there shouldn't be any. She would find doors open that she'd closed, and objects moved to places she hadn't left them. Max grew quieter, more distant, often staring out the window at nothing. It felt as though something dark was creeping into their lives. Determined to put her fears to rest, Emma decided to explore the attic, a place she'd avoided since they moved in. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the narrow staircase and pushed open the creaking door. The air was thick, and the smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. As she swept the light across the room, her eyes landed on something strange, an old, weathered trunk sitting in the corner, covered in dust. She knelt beside it, hands trembling, and slowly opened the lid. Inside were crumbling letters, photographs, and a diary belonging to a woman named Clara Townsend, who had once lived in the house. Flipping through the brittle pages, Emma read of Clara's tragic life, her descent into madness, and her obsession with escaping the house, though she felt she never could. The final entry read, "I am trapped here. My soul will never leave." After Emma's discovery, Max's behavior grew stranger. He began talking to someone in his room, laughing and whispering secrets. When Emma asked him who he was talking to, he replied, "My friend Clara. She says she wants me to stay with her." That night, Emma stayed up, sitting outside Max's room. Around midnight, she heard the soft, lilting melody of a lullaby coming from inside. The tune was faint but unmistakable, and it sent chills down her spine. She burst into the room, but Max was alone, fast asleep. The next morning, Max wouldn't meet her eyes. "Clara says you shouldn't come into my room at night, Mommy," he said flatly. It makes her angry. Emma's anxiety reached a fever pitch. Shadows flitted at the edges of her vision, and the whispers grew louder. She tried to tell Daniel, but he was dismissive, blaming the stress of the move. But when Lily, their younger daughter, began talking about seeing the Lady in White too, Daniel's skepticism began to waver. Emma felt trapped, desperate, and soon she became obsessed with Clara's diary. reading it over and over, trying to understand the spirit that haunted her home. She discovered that Clara had lost her own children under tragic circumstances and had been so devastated that she vowed no one else would ever take her place in the house. Emma realized that Clara wasn't just haunting them. She was trying to possess them, to reclaim the family she'd lost. One stormy night, Emma woke to the sound of soft crying. She got out of bed, drawn to the noise, which seemed to come from the basement. With each step, the crying grew louder and more anguished. At the bottom of the stairs, she saw her children standing in the darkness, their faces pale, their eyes glazed. They stared at her, emotionless, and began to whisper in unison, "She's here. She's coming for you." Suddenly, the room went cold, and Emma felt an invisible force wrap around her, choking her, pulling her down. She struggled, gasping for breath, and in her final moments of consciousness, she saw the faint outline of Clara's face, twisted in a malevolent smile. Emma awoke on the basement floor, shaken and disoriented. She knew they had to leave the house, that Clara's spirit would never let them go if they stayed. She ran to wake Daniel and gathered the children, frantically packing their belongings. As they tried to leave, the doors slammed shut, the windows rattled, and the lights flickered on and off. It was as though the house itself had come alive, determined to keep them there. With one final burst of strength, Emma threw open the front door, and they fled into the night, never looking back. They left everything behind, abandoning Willow Lane for good. In the years that followed, the Anders family spoke little of what happened. They never returned to the town, and the house on Willow Lane was left empty once more. But the whispers continued, and on quiet nights, the neighbours would hear the faint sound of a lullaby drifting from the windows, a sign that Clara's restless spirit was still there, waiting for her next family to take her place. To this day, they say no one should stay too long on Willow Lane, for fear of hearing Clara's voice, calling them to join her, forever. So, if you ever find yourself on Willow Lane, remember this story. Remember that some homes don't let go of their past, and some spirits never find peace. And if you hear a lullaby, don't look back, because once Clara sees you, she'll never let you go.